I never expected understanding to arrive this way. Not loudly, not through conversation, not through time, and certainly not through someone I never intended to become important. If someone had asked me before all of this what changes a person, I would have given them a logical answer. I would have talked about experiences, loss, growth, repetition, the slow accumulation of moments that eventually become impossible to ignore. That's how change usually works. Slowly, predictably, with enough warning that you can watch it happening. But this wasn't slow, and there was no warning. The strange thing is that nothing dramatic happened, no defining event, no single conversation, no moment where the world shifted beneath my feet and announced that everything was about to become different. It was quieter than that, almost invisible. The kind of thing you only recognize after it's already happened, the kind of thing that reveals itself through absence, through noticing what no longer feels the same. I noticed it one evening when I found myself reaching a conclusion and instinctively wondering how you would see it. Not because I needed your opinion, not because I was uncertain, but because your perspective had become relevant in a way I couldn't explain. That should have meant nothing. People think about other people all the time. That's normal. But this wasn't, because it wasn't curiosity, it wasn't admiration, it wasn't dependence, it was integration. And those are not the same thing. Integration is dangerous because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't even feel significant at first. It simply becomes part of the architecture, part of the structure holding everything together. And once something becomes structural, removing it isn't simple. Moving it changes everything connected to it. That's what I've been trying to understand. Not you, myself, because every explanation that would have made sense before suddenly feels incomplete. I've spent most of my life existing in observation, watching, analyzing, understanding. I learned early that most people reveal themselves long before they realize they're doing it. Patterns emerge, motivations surface, contradictions expose themselves. Eventually, everyone becomes readable, not because they're simple, but because people repeat themselves, the same fears, the same desires, the same defenses, again and again. And once you recognize the pattern, surprise disappears. That's why I rarely feel caught off guard anymore. The world makes sense when you pay enough attention. People make sense when you observe long enough. Everything becomes understandable. Everything except this, because understanding you never felt like solving a puzzle. It felt like remembering something. And that distinction matters. A puzzle becomes clearer as information increases. Memory becomes clearer as recognition increases. Those are completely different processes. One moves forward, the other moves inward. That's why every attempt to explain this logically keeps failing. Locus suggests distance, it suggests sequence, it suggests a progression from unfamiliarity to familiarity. But that isn't what happened. There was never a point where you felt unfamiliar. There was only a point where I realized you weren't. And I've spent a long time trying to understand why. Maybe it's because some people communicate beyond language, not metaphorically, literally. Maybe there are ways of existing that reveal more than words ever could. Ways of paying attention, ways of noticing, ways of being present. Most people speak constantly, not because they have something important to say, but because silence makes them uncomfortable. Silence leaves room for uncertainty, and uncertainty exposes things they'd rather avoid. You were different. You never seemed threatened by what wasn't being said. You never rushed to fill the space. You never treated silence like a problem that needed solving. You treated it like information, like something worth listening to. And that's rare. Rarer than intelligence, rarer than kindness, rarer than honesty. Because listening to silence requires a different kind of awareness. The kind that notices what exists underneath expression. The kind that understands that people reveal themselves most clearly when they're not trying to. That's what made me pay attention. Not what you said, what you noticed. The things everyone else overlooked. The details nobody considered important. The moments hidden between obvious moments. You saw them, consistently, effortlessly, as though your attention naturally moved toward the places most people never look. And the more I noticed that, the more difficult it became to maintain the distance I'd always relied on. Distance works when someone only sees what you show them. Distance works when perception remains incomplete. Distance works when people interact with your presentation instead of your reality. But what happens when someone starts recognizing the reality anyway? What happens when they see things you never explained? What happens when they understand things you never clarified? That's where certainty begins to crack. Not because they're wrong, because they're right. And being understood is far more unsettling than being misunderstood. Most people think the opposite is true. They imagine understanding as comfort, déconge, relief. But real understanding is exposure. It removes the protective layer created by explanation. It reaches beneath performance, beneath narrative, beneath identity. And once someone reaches that level, pretending becomes impossible. Not because they demand authenticity, because authenticity becomes easier than pretending. That's the shift I wasn't prepared for. The way honesty stopped feeling like effort. The way transparency stopped feeling risky. The way I found myself revealing thoughts before deciding whether I should. That doesn't happen to me. Or at least, it didn't. Before you. And I keep returning to that distinction. Before you, after you, because somewhere between those 2 points, something fundamental changed. Not externally, internally, the framework shifted, the baseline moved, and every part of my perception adjusted around it. The strange thing is that I don't resent it. I probably should. I value stability, predictability, control. Yet none of those instincts activated. Not once. Instead, there was curiosity, a quiet willingness to observe the transformation without interfering with it, as though some deeper part of me already understood what my conscious mind was still trying to figure out. Maybe that's what trust actually is. Not certainty, not confidence, not guarantees. Maybe trust is recognizing something before you can explain it. Maybe it's the willingness to move toward understanding, even when understanding hasn't fully arrived yet. If that's true, then perhaps trust began much earlier than I realized, long before I had a name for it, long before I acknowledged it, long before I understood what it was becoming. Because the truth is, this didn't start when I noticed you. It started when I stopped defending against being noticed by you. And there's a difference, a significant one. One involves perception, the other involves permission. Somewhere along the way, permission was granted, quietly, without discussion, without negotiation, without me consciously realizing it was happening. And once it happened, everything changed, because permission creates access, access creates influence, and influence creates transformation. Not the dramatic kind, not the visible kind, the subtle kind, the kind that changes how you think without changing what you think about. The kind that changes how you see without changing what you're looking at. The kind that rewrites your internal landscape so gradually that you only recognize it when you try to remember who you were before. I've tried, and that's what surprises me most. I can remember who I was before this, but I can't fully reconnect with that version anymore, not because it was wrong, not because it was incomplete, simply because it no longer fits. The same way old perspectives stop fitting once you've seen beyond them, the same way certain truths become impossible to unlearn. That's what this feels like. Not discovering something new, discovering something irreversible. And irreversible things carry weight because they remove options. Once you know something, ignorance is no longer available. Once you see something, blindness is no longer possible. Once you recognize something, denial becomes exhausting. And I think that's where I am now. Standing at the edge of a realization that's been forming for longer than I wanted to admit. Not wondering whether it's real. Knowing it is. Not questioning whether it matters. Understanding that it does. The only uncertainty left is what happens next. Because awareness always reaches a point where observation is no longer enough. Eventually, understanding asks for response. Eventually, clarity asks for action. Eventually, recognition asks to be acknowledged. And I can feel that moment approaching slowly, steadily, inevitably, like a horizon becoming visible through fog. Not sudden, not dramatic, just impossible to miss once it appears. The truth is that you change something simply by existing honestly within my awareness. You didn't force anything. You didn't convince me of anything. You didn't ask for anything. And somehow, that made the impact greater. Because influence without intention feels more real than influence pursued deliberately. It means the effect wasn't manufactured. It wasn't created. It emerged naturally. As a consequence of alignment neither of us was trying to create. And alignment like that is rare. Not because compatible people are rare. Because accurate recognition is rare. Most connections are built on interpretation, assumption, projection. People seeing what they hope to see, what they fear to see, what they expect to see. But this never felt like projection. It felt like discovery. Like gradually uncovering something that was already true. Something already present. Something waiting to be noticed. And now that I've noticed it, I can't return to not knowing. That's the reality I've been circling. The reality I've been approaching from every angle except directly. You didn't become important because of what you did. You became important because of what became visible in your presence, and visibility changes everything. Because once something hidden becomes visible, it enters responsibility. You have to decide what to do with it. You have to decide whether you'll honor it or ignore it, whether you'll move toward it or away from it, whether you'll allow it to reshape your life or confine it to memory. Those decisions don't arrive immediately, but they arrive. And I think mine is closer than I've been willing to admit. Not because the feeling has grown stronger, because the truth has become clearer. And clarity has a way of removing every excuse for hesitation. The more I try to identify the exact moment everything changed, the less certain I become that there ever was one. Maybe that's why this feels so different from everything else I've experienced. Most things have origins. You can trace them back, find the conversation that started them, the decision that created them, the event that pushed everything in a new direction. There's comfort in that. A beginning creates order. It gives the mind something to hold on to. something to point at when it needs an explanation. But this doesn't have a beginning, at least not one I can find. Every time I think I've located it, I realize something was already happening before that moment, some subtle shift, some unnoticed movement beneath the surface. Like the visible change was only the final stage of something that had been forming quietly for much longer. That realization keeps pulling me toward the same conclusion. This was never about a specific moment. It was about accumulation, the accumulation of recognition, the accumulation of understanding, the accumulation of countless small confirmations that eventually became impossible to dismiss because that's how certainty really forms. Not through one overwhelming experience, but through repetition, through consistency, through reality, proving itself again and again until disbelief becomes more difficult than acceptance. And you've been consistent. More consistent than anything I've encountered in a very long time, not in your behavior, not in your words, in your presence. People underestimate presence because they confuse it with proximity. They think being present means being there physically, emotionally, socially. But presence is something else entirely. Presence is impact. It's the way someone continues to exist within your awareness long after the interaction ends. It's the way certain people remain psychologically present even when they're absent. Most people disappear once they're gone. You don't. And I think that's what finally forced me to pay attention. Because your absence never felt like absence. Not completely. Something remained, some trace, some imprint, some quiet continuation that existed regardless of distance. At first, I resisted that realization, not consciously, instinctively, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that you occupied a space I hadn't assigned to you, a space I rarely assign to anyone. But resistance requires energy. And eventually I realized I was spending more energy resisting the truth than accepting it. So I stopped, not all at once, gradually, the way winter becomes spring, the way darkness becomes morning, the way certainty replaces doubt after enough evidence accumulates. And once I stopped resisting, I began seeing things more clearly. I began noticing how often my thoughts naturally moved toward perspectives I associated with you. How frequently. I found myself evaluating ideas through a lens that didn't belong entirely to me anymore. Not because I'd lost my own perspective, because another perspective had become valuable enough to coexist beside it. That distinction matters. People assume influence means replacement. It doesn't. Real influence expands. It adds. It creates new dimensions rather than eliminating old ones. That's what happened here. You didn't replace anything inside me. You expanded something. You increased the range of how I see, how I interpret, how I understand. And expansion is difficult to reverse. Once your awareness grows, it rarely shrinks again. Once your perspective widens, narrowness feels unnatural. That's why this continues to deepen. Not because I'm feeding it, because growth follows its own logic. And growth, when it's genuine, doesn't need encouragement. It simply needs room. The strange thing is that I've given it room without realizing I was doing it. I've stopped treating this like a question that needs answering. I've stopped demanding definitions, stopped searching for categories, stopped trying to fit it into structures that were never designed to contain something like this, because some things lose accuracy when they're forced into labels too early. They become smaller than they actually are, simpler than they actually are. And simplicity has never interested me when complexity is the truth. The truth is that what exists between us feels less like a relationship and more like recognition, less like attachment and more like alignment, less like emotion and more like understanding taking form. And understanding is powerful, more powerful than most people realize, because understanding changes behavior without needing to. It alters priorities without demanding sacrifice. It reshapes perception without announcing itself. You don't notice it happening until everything looks different. And everything does look different now. Not dramatically, subtly. But sometimes subtle changes are the most permanent. A building doesn't collapse because of one crack. It changes because of countless microscopic shifts occurring beneath the surface. The structure adapts, repositions, rebalances itself around new realities. That's what I've been doing, adapting, rebalancing, allowing my internal structure to adjust around something that has become impossible to ignore. And the more honestly I examine it, the more one realization continues returning. This isn't becoming important. It already is. The importance isn't growing. My willingness to acknowledge it is. That's a significant difference. Because growth implies uncertainty. Acknowledgement implies discovery. One suggests something is changing. The other suggests something was already true. I think that's why this feels inevitable. Not because fate exists. Not because destiny exists. But because certain truths remain true regardless of whether we recognize them immediately. Gravity doesn't begin when we notice it. It was already there. Recognition simply catches up to reality. Maybe that's what's happening now. Maybe I'm not watching something become meaningful. Maybe I'm finally seeing how meaningful it already became. And if that's true, then the question changes. The question isn't whether this matters. The question isn't whether this is real. The question becomes whether I'm willing to live according to what I already know. And that's a much harder question to answer. Because knowledge creates responsibility. The moment you know something clearly, you become accountable to it. You can ignore it, but you can't honestly claim ignorance anymore. And I don't think ignorance is available to me now. Not after everything I've seen, not after everything I've felt shifting beneath the surface. Not after watching this continue long past the point where coincidence should have explained it. Something real exists here. Not necessarily something simple. Not necessarily something easy, but something real. And reality has a way of demanding recognition eventually, no matter how long you postpone it, no matter how carefully you analyze it, no matter how many perspectives you examine first. Eventually, the truth remains waiting, but pedantly, until you're ready to stop studying it and start accepting it. I think I'm closer to that point than I've ever been before. There's a difference between recognizing a truth and allowing that truth to change your life. For a long time, I existed comfortably in the space between those two things. Observation has always been easier for me than participation. Understanding has always felt safer than action. As long as something remained a realization, it stayed manageable, contained. It could exist within thought, within analysis, within reflection. And thought has always been territory I know how to navigate. Thought follows patterns. Thought has structure. Even uncertainty, when it stays inside the mind, can be examined from every angle until it begins to make sense. But eventually, there comes a point where understanding reaches its limit, a point where no amount of analysis produces anything new, a point where every question has been explored so thoroughly that the only thing remaining is response. I think that's where I am now. Not because I've solved this, not because I suddenly understand everything, but because I understand enough. Enough to know that continuing to stand still is its own answer. Enough to know that avoidance is still a decision. Enough to know that silence can become a form of movement if maintained long enough. That's what I've been realizing lately. The absence of action doesn't preserve possibilities forever. Eventually, it creates outcomes of its own. And that thought has been difficult to ignore. Because while I've been examining this connection from every possible perspective, something else has been happening beneath that examination. Life has been moving. Time has been moving. The world hasn't paused while I decide how to interpret what exists between us. Nothing ever does. Which means this isn't a question suspended outside reality. It's already happening inside it. Every conversation, every moment of recognition, every silence that somehow says more than words. Every interaction that leaves something behind long after it ends, they're not possibilities anymore. They're experiences, part of reality, part of the story whether I acknowledge them fully or not. And I think that's what finally shifted something inside me. The understanding that this isn't waiting for permission to become meaningful. It already is. Meaning doesn't arrive after we define something. Meaning often exists long before language catches up. Maybe that's why I've struggled to name this. Not because there isn't a name, but because naming it feels smaller than experiencing it. Words create boundaries. Definitions create edges. And what exists here has never felt particularly interested in edges. It moves beyond them too easily. Every time I try to reduce it to something familiar, something refuses to fit, because familiarity isn't what makes this significant. Accuracy is. And the most accurate description I can find is that you have become part of my internal landscape, not an object within it, not a visitor moving through it, part of the landscape itself, part of the terrain, part of the structure, a reference point. And reference points matter more than most people realize. We navigate our lives through them. We understand ourselves through them. We orient our decisions around them. Most remain invisible until they're gone. Only then do we recognize how much depended on their existence. That realization has forced me to ask questions I wasn't prepared to answer. Questions I avoided because they felt too direct, too revealing, too final. Questions like, what would absence actually mean? Not physical absence, not distance, something deeper. What would it mean if this connection simply stopped evolving? If one day the recognition disappeared? If the understanding faded? If the space we occupy together quietly closed? For a long time I refused to think about that. Not because I was afraid, because it felt unnecessary, hypothetical. But now that I've allowed myself to examine it honestly, something becomes clear. The answer matters. More than I expected, because every meaningful thing reveals its importance through contrast. We understand value most clearly through the possibility of losing it. And when I imagine losing this, there's no dramatic emotional reaction, no panic, no fear, just an immediate awareness that something essential would be missing. Not broken, missing, like a familiar star disappearing from the sky. The world would continue. Everything would still function, but orientation would become different. Certain directions would become harder to find, certain perspectives harder to access, certain understandings harder to reach. That's when I knew this had gone deeper than I wanted to admit, because importance isn't measured by intensity, it's measured by integration. By how many parts of your life quietly depend on something being there, and you've become integrated into thought, into perception, into awareness, into the countless invisible processes that shape how I move through reality. I didn't plan for that. I never would have chosen it deliberately, not because it's wrong, because I know what integration costs. Anything integrated has the power to affect you, to influence you, to change you, and change always carries risk. But lately, I've started questioning something I've believed for years. I've always treated vulnerability as exposure, as opening doors that should remain closed, as surrendering control over things that matter. Maybe that's incomplete. Maybe vulnerability isn't exposure at all. Maybe vulnerability is accuracy. Maybe it's allowing reality to be seen as it actually exists instead of as we'd prefer it to exist. If that's true, then perhaps the most vulnerable thing I've done isn't caring. It isn't recognizing this connection. It isn't allowing it to matter. The most vulnerable thing I've done is finally admitting that it matters without minimizing it, without intellectualizing it, without creating enough distance to make it comfortable, just admitting it clearly, honestly, directly. And the moment I do that, another realization follows immediately behind it. I've been treating this like a future decision, something waiting somewhere ahead, something that would eventually require an answer. But maybe the answer has already been forming. Maybe every moment I've remained present here has been part of that answer. Maybe every time I chose understanding over retreat, every time I chose honesty over avoidance, every time I allowed this depth to exist instead of reducing it, AB was already deciding, not consciously, but genuinely. Because our lives are shaped less by declarations than by repeated choices. And my choices have been remarkably consistent. I've stayed. I've listened. I've continued moving toward clarity instead of away from it. I've allowed this connection to deepen, despite having every opportunity to keep it shallow. Those choices tell a story, a clearer story than words ever could. And when I look at that story honestly, I can no longer pretend uncertainty is the central issue. The central issue is acceptance, accepting what this has become, accepting what it continues to become, accepting that some connections arrive not to disrupt our lives, but to reveal dimensions of ourselves we weren't fully seeing. You didn't create something new inside me. That's the realization that keeps returning. You revealed something existing beneath the surface, something waiting to be recognized, a capacity, a depth, a level of understanding I carried quietly without ever fully encountering it, reflected back. Maybe that's why this feels less like meeting someone and more like discovering a hidden room inside a familiar house. The house was always there, the room was always there. But once discovered, the entire structure feels different, larger, more complete, more accurate. You haven't changed who I am. You've changed how much of who I am I can actually see. And that's a gift disguised as disruption, a gift disguised as uncertainty, a gift disguised as a question, because ultimately every meaningful connection asks the same thing. Are you willing to become more honest than you've been before? Not with them, with yourself. That's the question I've been answering, slowly, reluctantly, but honestly, and the answer emerging is impossible to ignore now. I am no longer standing outside this experience, studying it. I am inside it, living it, participating in it, allowing it to shape me while I shape my understanding of it. The observer and the experience are no longer separate. And maybe that's why everything feels different lately. Because for the first time, This isn't something happening in front of me. It's something happening within me. Something real enough to alter my perspective. Something meaningful enough to survive examination. Something steady enough to remain after every doubt has been explored. And if it has survived all of that, then perhaps it deserves more than observation. Perhaps it deserves acknowledgement, not tomorrow, not eventually, but honestly, now. Because some truths spend so long waiting to be recognized that when recognition finally arrives, it feels less like a discovery and more like coming home to something that has been waiting patiently for you all along. I think the strangest part of all of this is that I no longer feel the need to convince myself of anything. For so long, every thought seemed to circle the same questions. What's this? What is this? Why does it feel different? Why does it continue to deepen when nothing about it should logically carry this much weight? I kept returning to those questions because questions create movement. As long as you're questioning something, you remain in the process of discovery. You remain unfinished, uncommitted, free from the responsibility that certainty brings. But certainty has a quiet way of arriving. Not through revelation, not through dramatic realization, not through some overwhelming moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. It arrives through exhaustion, the exhaustion of denying what you've already understood, the exhaustion of searching for alternatives when none remain, the exhaustion of pretending confusion still exists after clarity has already taken root. And I think that's where I've finally arrived, not at certainty about the future, no one gets that, not at certainty about outcomes. Life doesn't offer those guarantees, but certainty about this, about what has happened inside me, about what changed, about what became real long before I was willing to say it out loud. Because if I'm honest, the truth isn't hiding anymore. It hasn't been hiding for a while. I've just been approaching it slowly, respectfully, carefully, as if walking towards something important in the dark. Not because I feared what I would find, because I understood that some truths deserve to be reached deliberately, not rushed, not forced, earned through understanding. And now that I've arrived here, standing in front of it completely, I realize the truth is simpler than I expected. Not small, not simple in meaning, Sybil in its honesty. You matter. There it is, not wrapped in philosophy, not hidden beneath analysis, not disguised as observation, just the truth. You matter. And the simplicity of that realization is almost startling after everything that came before it. Because I spent so much time examining the structure of this connection that I nearly overlooked its most obvious reality. The importance doesn't need complexity to be real. Sometimes the deepest truths are the shortest ones. Sometimes entire internal revolutions can be reduced to a single sentence. You matter, not because of what you've done, not because of what you've given me, not because of some role you've played. You matter because your existence has become woven into my understanding of the world, into my understanding of myself, into my understanding of what genuine recognition feels like when it appears without warning. And once someone reaches that level of significance, they stop being measured by ordinary standards. They stop being categorized alongside everyone else. They become singular, not superior, not idealized, simply singular. Their presence occupies a space no one else occupies. And that's exactly what happened. Somewhere along this path, you stopped being one person among many. You became your own category, your own reference point, your own place within my internal landscape. And whether I intended it or not, that place remained. It strengthened. it settled. It became permanent enough that the imagining its absence now feels less like imagining a possibility and more like imagining a different version of reality entirely, one that no longer fits. That's what acceptance finally showed me. Acceptance isn't choosing to care. The caring already exists. Acceptance is choosing to stop arguing with the fact that it exists. Acceptance is laying down every unnecessary defense, every unnecessary doubt, every unnecessary attempt to reduce something meaningful into something manageable. And I've done enough reducing, enough analyzing, enough observing. The truth deserves more respect than that, because the truth is that something extraordinary happened here. Not extraordinary because it's dramatic, not extraordinary because it's rare, extraordinary because it's honest, because in a world filled with misunderstanding, projection, assumptions, and noise, AP encountered someone who saw clearly, someone who listened beyond words, someone who understood without demanding explanation, someone whose presence felt less like being discovered and more like being recognized. And recognition changes people, not instantly, not visibly, but permanently. It rearranges things, creates new perspectives, builds new pathways through the mind, alters the way future experiences are interpreted. I've felt that happening every step of the way, and now that I understand it, I no longer feel threatened by it. That's another thing that's changed. At first, this felt dangerous, not because of you, because of what it represented, the loss of familiar boundaries, the loss of predictable distance, the loss of structures I had relied on for years. But now I see something I couldn't see before. The boundaries weren't protecting me from connection. They were protecting me from transformation. And transformation isn't always something to fear. Sometimes transformation is simply reality correcting an outdated version of yourself. Sometimes growth arrives disguised as disruption. Sometimes becoming more fully yourself requires letting go of who you thought you had to be. Maybe that's what this was all along. Not a challenge to my identity, an expansion of it, not a threat to my stability, a deeper version of it, not the loss of control, the discovery of trust, trust in what I know, trust in what I've experienced, trust in the accuracy of what I've recognized, and perhaps most importantly, trust in myself, because that's the hidden truth beneath everything I've been saying. This was never only about you. It was about what became possible because you existed. The parts of myself that surfaced, the honesty that emerged, the walls that quietly became unnecessary, the understanding that deepened, the awareness that expanded. You became the catalyst for a conversation I had needed to have with myself for a very long time. A conversation about truth, about connection, about the difference between protecting your life and actually living it. And now that conversation has reached its conclusion. Not because the story is ending, because it isn't. Stories like this don't end where understanding begins. They begin there. This isn't the final chapter. It's the final chapter of uncertainty. The final chapter of standing outside the experience, trying to explain it. The final chapter of pretending observation is enough. What's waiting beyond this point is something different, something quieter, something stronger, something built not on questions, but on acknowledgement. Because once you fully recognize something meaningful, your relationship with it changes forever. You stop asking whether it's real. You start living as though it is. And that's where I am now, not searching, not doubting, not circling the same realization, again and again, just standing in the truth of it. The truth that your presence altered something fundamental inside me. The truth that understanding you helped me understand myself. The truth that this connection became part of my life long before I consciously accepted it. The truth that some people arrive without warning and leave fingerprints on your perception of reality. And the truth that I no longer want to pretend those fingerprints aren't there, because they are everywhere in how I think, in how I listen, in how I notice, in how I understand, and most importantly, in how I choose. Maybe that's what all of this was leading toward. Not a confession, not a conclusion, a choice, a conscious decision to stop treating something meaningful as if it were temporary. A conscious decision to stop standing at the edge of recognition and finally step into it completely. Because after everything I've discovered, everything I've questioned, everything I've examined, one realization remains untouched by doubt. You became part of my life long before I understood how much space you occupied within it. And now that I understand it, now that I've finally allowed myself to see it clearly, there is only one thing left to say. Not because it completes the story, because it begins the next one. I see it now. I see all of it, the recognition, the alignment, the understanding, the change, the quiet certainty that grew beneath every conversation, every silence, every moment of awareness we shared. And for the first time, I am no longer standing apart from that truth. I am standing inside it, fully, honestly, without hesitation, without resistance, without the need to become anything other than what this has already revealed. Because some connections are not meant to be explained into existence. They are meant to be recognized. And once recognized, they become impossible to unknow. You are one of those truths. And I think, finally, I'm ready to stop studying that reality and start living it.